Welcome to Lizzie Borden Audio, the podcast made entirely from primary nonfiction sources from the 1892 trial of Lizzie Borden. Today, we have a letter from a donated collection of old records to the Fall River Historical Society from the grandson of prosecutor Hosea Knowlton in 1989. Prior to that time, fans were unaware that the government employed confidential informants in this famous case. And now, the statement of Nellie McHenry after her interview with the Borden's maid, Bridget Sullivan.
I'm Nellie McHenry, and this is August 25th, 1892. I'm a private detective employed by the government to interview Bridget Sullivan, the Borden's maid. I hereby enclose my statement to the City Marshal of Fall River, Rufus B. Hilliard. Dear Sir, I herein enclose the statement of Bridget Sullivan made to me at her boarding place in Fall River on the 19th of August, 1892, between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. After stating to her that I was from Tiverton, Rhode Island, and related to poor Mrs. Borden, that I wished to hear her story myself. Therefore, I called upon her personally for that reason, and after talking with her for about 2 hours, I elicited the following: that Mr. and Mrs. Borden had been very sick all night. Mrs. Borden asked Bridget if she had heard them vomiting, said someone had been trying to poison them and that she was going to see Dr. Bowen, but she knew they would not like it. Also asked Bridget if she had eaten the same food. She answered yes. All but the baker's bread. Mrs. Borden then burned the bread in the stove and burned herself doing it. Bridget ate her breakfast and was taken sick. She went into the yard and vomited it all up. Bridget denied telling the O'Neill girl that Lizzie sent her upstairs to clean the windows. Mrs. Borden told Bridget to clean the windows herself, and she did so with a brush. She saw a Mr. Baker and a Mrs. Kelly's girl while doing them. So that was the last she ever heard Mrs. Borden say anything, and the last she ever saw of her. Mrs. Borden had been talking about Mr. Morse all week long, saying, "Now he is here, and I suppose we will have him on our hands all summer. I don't see why he don't get married and go away." Bridget also said if he had not come there, this poor old lady would be alive today, as it was his being there that took her to that part of the house. She never went there, as she knew well she was not wanted. The bed was found made. Even the shams, and Bridget supposed the old lady had made it, as she was found dead in his room. Bridget was positive Lizzie was ironing when she went upstairs. Lizzie told Bridget that morning that there was a special sale at Sergeant's dry goods store, that they were selling the gingham for 8 cents per yard, and asked Bridget why she did not go down. Bridget said she would get there before they were all gone. I asked Bridget why the newspaper said so much about the fire. She said, "Oh, there were no clothes or rags found. She might have burned them all up." Bridget then referred to the fact that Mrs. Borden always spoke about anything she was going to do or anything that happened about the house. Even if she was going out for a yeast cake, she would tell Bridget that she was going. So in answer to the question if Mrs. Borden received a note, she said no, she did not believe Mrs. Borden received a note, and she was sure she would have spoken to her about it. Also, the front door had not been opened by Bridget until Mr. Borden returned, and it was fastened in such a way that he could not open it with his key. And when Bridget tried to let him in, she could not open it at first, and she said, "Oh, pshaw!" As soon as she spoke, she heard Lizzie laugh upstairs and looked up and saw her on the landing. Mr. Borden came in and went into the sitting room. He did not ask for Mrs. Borden, as was his usual habit. Bridget felt sick to her stomach and had a bad headache after she finished the windows. She went upstairs and laid across the foot of her own bed. She did not go to sleep, but heard the clock strike 11, got up and looked at her own clock, thought it would soon be time to go downstairs to get the regular noon meal. It did not seem but a few minutes when Miss Lizzie called, "Maggie, come down quick, Father is dead. Go for Dr. Bowen." Bridget is called Maggie. Bridget was so frightened she did not look at Mr. Borden but ran out for the doctor. Then Bridget asked, "Where is Mrs. Borden?" Lizzie said she went out. "Go up to Mrs. Churchill's. I think you'll find her there." Bridget went and came back with Mrs. Churchill, and together they went over the house and upstairs to Morse's room, where they found her. Mrs. Borden was dead, and she was so awfully frightened she put her arms around Mrs. Churchill and cried. Miss Lizzie was quite cool and not nervous. Dr. Bowen came running out of Mr. Borden's room, all excited and with tears running down his cheeks, saying, "Oh, he is murdered! He is murdered to fucking pieces!" I asked Bridget how it could happen that Mrs. Borden was killed right in her own house, and no one heard her cry out, although Lizzie was so near Bridget, and her answer was, "That is just what I said to Miss Lizzie." And she said, "Oh, I heard her groan." Then Bridget added, "I told that to the court and to the judge." Bridget said it was her custom to fasten the cellar door after washing, and if it was open, someone opened it. When she started to clean the windows, Lizzie was going to hook the back door, but Bridget said she would be at work right there. She could see to it. Bridget spoke of where she had worked in Fall River at Mrs. Reed's in Remington. She said she came from Newport about 3 years ago, was there to visit 3 weeks before, and stayed all night. When she got out of this, she was going back to Newport. Bridget further stated that Mrs. Borden was always very kind and good to her, and would talk to her about what she was going to do. The girls, particularly Miss Lizzie, were very different, always keeping to themselves, and no one ever was allowed to go to Miss Lizzie's room. She took care of it herself. Bridget often said it was too bad Mrs. Borden was their stepmother. She was too good for them, and they did not like her. I asked Bridget if they quarreled. She said she would not want to say anything about that. Of course they would not quarrel in front of me. I pressed her upon this subject, but she evidently did not want to talk about it. She further stated that she made up her mind 3 times to leave there and gave in her notice, but Mrs. Borden coaxed her to stay and once raised her wages. Mrs. Borden was so good that Bridget stayed, but was intending to leave. She gave us her reason that while the work was not hard, the place was not pleasant for any girl on account of the odd habits of the family. She said things were not pleasant in the house. I asked how it was. "Well, the girls keep so much to themselves,
There's no love for their stepmother."
The above report is in substance the result of the 2 hours of conversation with Bridget Sullivan. Mrs. Nellie S. McHenry, August 25, 1892. Statement by Detective Nellie McHenry. Handwritten in ink.
Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. You know how it goes. But how much of that rhyme is based on, actual fact and how much is just, speculation? We always seem to love a good mystery, right?
Right.
That's what we're doing here today. We're going back in time, back to 1892, Fall River, Massachusetts, to the Borden murders. Andrew and Abby Borden found brutally murdered in their home. And, of course, suspicion falls on their daughter, Lizzie.
Of course.
But we're not just looking at the basic facts of the case again. We're diving into the good stuff, the trial transcripts, witness testimonies, all that evidence that was presented in court to see if, maybe we can find some details that challenge what we think we know about this case. And joining me in the deep dive is an expert, someone who knows these transcripts, knows this case probably better than Lizzie Borden knew her own house. So let's jump right in with the medical evidence. I mean, a trial like this, you have to set the scene, right? So what can you tell us about those original autopsy reports? What did they find?
Well, they're definitely pretty gruesome, as you can imagine. The autopsies themselves were done very soon after the bodies were found. And they detail pretty meticulously, I might add, that Mr. Borden suffered 10 to 11 blows to the head.
Wow.
Mrs. Borden was struck 19 times.
19 times. It's no wonder this case still has people talking.
Oh, absolutely. And it's brutal for sure. But there are these curious details in the autopsy reports that really complicate the whole thing. Like when they describe the wounds, the shape of them, how deep they were. It suggests that the weapon was something lighter than an axe.
See, that's interesting because you think about Lizzie Borden and you think Lizzie Borden took an axe. You know the rhyme. Are we saying that she maybe didn't use an axe, that it was something else entirely?
It's something to consider, right? And that's not the only thing. The autopsy report, it also mentions this difference in digestion between Mr. and Mrs. Borden. I mean, even the medical expert, he said, and this is a quote from the transcript, assuming the digestion to have gone on naturally in both cases, the difference would be somewhere in the neighborhood of an hour and a half, more or less.
An hour and a half. That's a pretty big detail to just gloss over, especially when you think about the prosecution. They were trying to say, okay, this happened then, and then this, and then this, putting Lizzie at the scene for both murders.
Yeah, it definitely throws a wrench in their timeline. Makes you wonder if there was someone else there, someone else involved, or if Lizzie really could have done both. If there was that much time in between. I mean, these are all things that the defense would have been, all over.
It's like putting together a puzzle and you find this one piece and it's like, that doesn't fit. And you have to rethink everything. But before we get too far into the timeline, let's talk about some of that physical evidence from the scene, like the hatchet. What can you tell us about that?
All right. So the hatchet. Yeah, they found a hatchet. No handle, just the head in the basement of the house.
Yeah.
It was a big deal. At first, at least.
That was the prosecution's big thing, right? This is the murder weapon. This is what Lizzie used.
Well, about that. Wasn't so simple. See, the hatchet, it had this white film all over it. And they couldn't tell if there was even any blood on it.
Seriously. You'd think with a case like this, something like that would be, I don't know, important. Were they just not as careful back then?
Well, forensic science, it wasn't what it is today. Back in 1892, they didn't have all the fancy tools and techniques they have now. It's actually, listen to this. This is Professor Wood. He's the one who examined the hatchet. Well, he says right here in the trial transcript, when I received this hatchet, the handle was driven into the head. The cutting edge is seen to have a number of reddish-brown stains. When I received this hatchet, the handle was driven into the head to the distance which you see marked here by this line.
So they've got this hatchet, right, covered in who knows what, some reddish-brown stains, maybe blood, maybe not, and they're trying to say it's the murder weapon. I can't imagine how frustrating that would be.
Oh, for sure. Adds to the mystery, though, right?
Oh.
Speaking of mysteries, we've got to talk about that note.
The note. Lizzie and that note she just happened to find, the one saying her mother was in danger.
Sounds like something out of one of those penny dreadfuls. And just like in those stories, the note hit up and vanishes. Poof. Gone.
So no one ever actually saw this note except Lizzie. What'd they do about that in court?
Well, they couldn't just ignore it, right? The prosecution tried, bless their hearts, to find anyone who'd seen this note. They couldn't. It was all just Lizzie's word. Can you imagine a whole murder case potentially hinging on a note no one's even seen?
I mean, if they couldn't prove it was real, why even bring it up? Seems like it would just make things worse for them.
Well, they had a thought. The prosecution, they argued, get this, and I'm quoting from the transcripts again here, that this mysterious note, it could have been part of the scheme of assassination.
Hold on. So they're saying Lizzie planted it, or someone else did to throw them off.
Exactly. A fabrication or a distraction tactic. Like I said, it's like something out of a story.
It's like we keep adding more and more puzzle pieces, but none of them actually seem to fit together. Was it real? Was it fake? Was it meant to mislead everyone? Who knows?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's not just about the note itself, is it? It's about what it tells us about how things were done back then. Did they miss something? Was something messed up? We're left wondering. That's a whole other rabbit hole to go down.
This case, it's all these little details, these inconsistencies, these questions that just hang there unanswered. And that's what makes it so fascinating. Like trying to solve a puzzle when half the pieces are missing. And speaking of missing pieces, what about Lizzie and her sister Emma? What were their parts in all of this, in the trial itself?
Now, this is where we get into the human side of things. See, Lizzie herself, she never actually says she's innocent during the whole trial, leaves all the talking to her lawyers, never takes the stand.
Wow. Imagine that, being accused of something so awful and just staying silent.
It's deafening, isn't it? Her silence. But her sister, Emma, she does talk. And what she says, well, it's pretty telling.
Okay, this is good, because now we're not just talking about evidence and timelines. We're actually getting a look inside that house. What was the Borden family really like?
Exactly. Now, Emma, she defends Lizzie, of course, but she also lets some things slip. There were, shall we say, disagreements, conflicts, like about inheritance, things like that. And hints, just hints, mind you, about some of Lizzie's, well, let's just call it unusual behavior.
Oh, now come on. You can't just leave it at that. What kind of unusual behavior are we talking about here?
Well, let's just say that it all paints a picture of a family that wasn't exactly, well, picture perfect.
It's like there's the main story, the murders, and then this whole other story underneath it, all this drama and tension just bubbling below the surface. You have to wonder what else was going on in that house that we just don't know about. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Yeah. About how easily we can get caught up in the crime itself. But there are always these human lives at the center of it all.
It's easy to forget sometimes. These were real people with real lives. And everything changed for them on that August day.
And those lives, their relationships, it all played a part in the trial, didn't it? Especially for Lizzie's defense team. I mean, they were up against a lot. Circumstantial evidence, public opinion, everything. How'd they even begin to, fight back against all of that?
Well, they were smart about it. Focused on those inconsistencies we've talked about, like that gap between when Mr. and Mrs. Borden were killed, the digestion thing, trying to show that the prosecution's timeline, well, maybe it wasn't so airtight.
Because if she didn't do it then she couldn't have done it. Right. At least that's what they were going for, I guess.
Exactly. And don't forget about the lack of, hard evidence. Like that hatchet. They couldn't even say for sure if it was used in the murders. The defense really used that. They said, look, if Lizzie Borden had done this, she would have gotten rid of the weapon, right? There wouldn't be any blood, any clothing, anything. And they never found any of that.
So they basically said, if the shoe doesn't fit, you can't convict her.
Pretty much. They said, hey, the crime scene, it was a mess. People coming and going. Maybe they missed something. Maybe something got moved, creating that doubt.
It's amazing how much things have changed. I mean, today they'd have the whole place taped off, people in those suits taking pictures, everything.
Oh, absolutely. Back then it was all eyewitness accounts, what people saw, what they thought they saw. Today we have DNA, luminol, all sorts of technology they couldn't even dream of back in 1892.
Makes you wonder what would happen if they tried this case today with all that we know now. But I mean, even without all that fancy technology, the prosecution, they still made some good points.
Oh, they did. But the defense, they played on something else, something that mattered a lot back then. Think about Lizzie, an unmarried woman in her 30s, living with her parents. They used that, painted her as a victim, someone being unfairly judged because she didn't fit in.
Classic strategy. It's not about the facts. It's about who they can make you believe. In this case, Lizzie, the dutiful daughter.
And it worked. The jury, they had deliberated for a little over an hour, and the verdict, not guilty.
And not guilty. After all that, after weeks of testimony, all that evidence, the jury, they just said not guilty. It's hard to imagine even now how people must have reacted.
Oh, I bet. But that's the thing about these transcripts. They give us that window into the past. You read about the trial, sure, but to hear the words, to see how they argued, how they spoke, it just hits different.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've gone through the evidence, the arguments, the societal norms of the time. Everything that made this case the phenomenon, it still is.
And that's what we do here, right? Take a little deeper, look beyond the surface, ask those questions, even when, or maybe especially when, there aren't any easy answers.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, there's one last thing to think about. Lizzie's lawyer, he said that, her demeanor, the fact that she didn't seem emotional, that was proof she was innocent, a woman in shock, that's all. But there were others who said, no, that was the face of a cold-blooded killer. What do you believe? It's a question that's haunted this case for over a century, and one, well, I think we each have to answer for ourselves. Thank you for coming along with us on this journey back to 1892 and the Borden murders. We'll be back soon with another deep dive, so until then, keep asking those questions and looking.
You've been listening to Lizzie Borden Audio's podcast of Private Detective Nellie McHenry's statement to the City Marshal of Fall River just a few weeks after the deaths of Andrew and Abby Borden. Due to the nature of her work, very little is known about her other than she and her husband, Detective Edwin McHenry, both worked as successful operatives employed by the government. Tanya Montoya plays Nellie McHenry. Royalty-free music Adrenaline Action by John Wright. The interview by trial experts was AI generated by Google Notebook, LLM with testimony provided with permission from the website of Lizzie Andrew Borden by Stephanie Corey. Source documents were provided from the Knowlton Papers, published by the Fall River Historical Society. Royalty-free music is called Unstoppable, also by John Wright. Directed and produced by Kate Lavender. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment on our YouTube channel. And I'm Mike Payne, and we'll see you in the next one, Lizzie lovers.